that is the community that is most at risk in these circumstances. That'll be 300,000 additional doses that will be brought forward and provided next week. We have had some success in recent days of accessing additional doses, which I can't go into the commercial arrangements for. This means that these additional doses going into Sydney in particular will not come at the expense of the ongoing allocations that are being made to other states and territories. More broadly, I note that yesterday was reported another record day of vaccinations at 165,000 doses, some 140,000 today, 8.7 million in total, 1 million doses in just over a week, in 8 days, and we are not far from hitting that 7-day million dose target that we've been working to for some time now. Speaking to Lieutenant General Fruin early today, 72% of those over 70 have had their first dose, 55.29% over 50 have had their first dose, 31.8% over 16, getting to almost 1 in 3 eligible Australians now having had received their first dose, and we now note that more than 1 in 10 aged over 16 have now had both doses. I want to stress again the importance of aged care workers, and particularly those aged over 70 going and having their vaccinations. Those vaccinations for over 70s have been available now for some time, and while we've been, as I've just noted, we've got a pretty high level now of those aged over 70, over 70% have had that first dose. Now go and get your second dose if it's been at least 8 weeks for you to receive that. Equally with aged care workers, we'll be continuing working with the states and territories again both tonight amongst health ministers and premiers tomorrow to implement the decision of National Cabinet to ensure that that's a mandatory scheme. Lieutenant General Fruin has been working with the states as well on how we can put in place more effective in-reach services to ensure that we're vaccinating as many of those aged care workers as possible, and ensure that the priority lane and priority access for aged care workers is being afforded both through the GP arrangements, and remembering now we have a much greater level of GPs, higher number I should say of GPs now having access to the Pfizer vaccine, and I expect that to be seen as a priority for those workers. Just before I go to questions, I also note congratulations to Patty Mills and Kate Campbell on being appointed as our flag bearers at the forthcoming Olympics. For both of them, it's their 4th Olympics. That's an extraordinary achievement for any athlete to get to 1 Olympics, but to go to 4 and to represent your country in this way, and particularly as an Indigenous Australian, for Patty Mills, I think that will be a very special moment for all Australians. So I wish them all the best in Tokyo and congratulate them on that achievement, and also note that Ash Barty's playing Angelique Kerber tonight. I'm sure there'll be a few Australians watching that later tonight. With that, let's go to questions.
Prime Minister, the Premier says that this lockdown is being extended because there simply is not enough vaccines. You've announced an extra 300,000 to go to New South Wales today. That simply isn't going to cut it. So is this lockdown on you now?
At no stage, at any time, in the last 12 months, has there been any suggestion that Australia would have reached a level of vaccination at the level we now see in the UK, which I note is not even yet at 65% for 2 doses at this time. The National Vaccination Plan that was adopted last year, and all of the targets, even on their most optimistic scenarios, which haven't been realised, none of them put Australia in a position where a suppression strategy could have been lifted at any time, at least by the end of October. So the suggestion that somehow there was a vaccination rate that would have put us in a different position right now to what was planned last year is simply not true. There was never a 65% opportunity for Australia at this time of the year. I mean, the vaccines themselves were not approved by the TGA until the earlier part of this year. Secondly, the AstraZeneca vaccine, as we know, has been subject in this country to a TARGI advice, which had a significant impact on the use of that vaccine in Australia. We would have had considerable more doses available to Australians in the absence of those ATAGI rulings. Let's not forget that 44 million UK residents have been successfully vaccinated with the AstraZeneca vaccine. UK has not been vaccinated by Pfizer or Moderna. They've been vaccinated with the AstraZeneca vaccine. And the availability of that vaccine under the medical advice in this country has been very different to that overseas. Now, undoubtedly, that has had a big impact on the rates of vaccination that we've been able to achieve to this point. The countries that manufacture the mRNA vaccines in the United Kingdom and Europe, they had first access to all of those vaccines. And Australia did not, nor did other countries, at the volumes that would have been necessary to achieve a higher rate of vaccination by this stage. That's why we focused on AstraZeneca, because we could make it here, and we could get it in the volumes which would have accelerated our vaccination rate beyond where we are now. Right now, we are catching up considerable time. At the rates we're now achieving, at some 1 million vaccinations almost a week, that will ensure, if we can keep that pace up, and the supply lines hold, and the supply lines are firming, not weakening, then every Australian who wishes to have a vaccine by the end of the year, it is our intention, based on the advice of Lieutenant General Cruan, that will be possible. And I think that's where we need to be. That would only put us 2 months back from where we would have otherwise hoped to have been. And so the vaccination rate that you're seeing right now, and what might have otherwise been the case at this time, would have still required a suppression strategy right now. And to suggest otherwise is just completely and utterly false.
Prime Minister, how many of the United States' close allies have been able to secure additional doses from the US surplus, not from Pfizer, but from the surplus? 80 million last month. They went to places like Canada, Mexico, South Korea, Taiwan. Why hasn't Australia been able to leverage its so-called special relationship with the US to secure some of those surplus doses?
Well, in a number of those cases, they're subject to the agreements they already have with those countries, particularly Mexico and Canada. And I would note that in those countries also you were seeing a rate of death from COVID, which was very different to Australia. And Taiwan also more recently has seen a very rapid escalation in their case numbers. As I'm sure you're aware, and South Korea always had more fatalities than Australia. And we have been accessing additional doses. It's true, we have. We've been able to do that through our relationship with Pfizer, the additional doses out of Moderna, and we're accessing those. But equally, the focus of the United States, and indeed Japan and India and others, and particularly through the Quad initiative and the G7 initiative, is increasingly focusing on developing countries. I mean, we're seeing death on our doorstep in Indonesia right now. And we've just reached out further again. I was in contact with President Widodo yesterday. Australia, working with other countries, will continue to support developing countries whose challenge is the most extreme. People are dying in Indonesia. People are still dying in the United Kingdom. People are still dying in the United States. I mean, there were more cases yesterday in the United Kingdom than we've had in total in 18 months.
Have you tried those?
Of course we have.
Was the answer no?
And we've been accessing vaccines.
Prime Minister, the Commonwealth was prepared to go at 50-50 with the states in terms of the economic support provided to individuals and to business. If you were prepared to go 50-50 with the states, why aren't you prepared to go 50-50 now, considering that the New South Wales Treasurer says he's tipping in $1.4 billion in business support? If you were prepared to go 50-50 then, why not now?
Well, I took a proposal to National Cabinet, and I'm acting in accordance with the decision of the National Cabinet, which is that we will cover the household assistance, which I've said today we are easing the restrictions on that. And so we're going further on that for the 3rd week. And that is the same rule that I'll apply to every other state and territory. The states agreed, including New South Wales, I stress, ultimately, to be part of that National Cabinet decision, that states would look after business support, and that the Commonwealth would look after household support. And what I have said, though, to the Premier and the Treasurer today is that given the circumstances we're now seeing unfolding in New South Wales, that we will work very closely to ensure that there is appropriate economic support should the conditions in New South Wales require further restrictions. So we are having that discussion with New South Wales. This is an iterative process. There are shifting sands when it comes to the evolution of this issue, and we're working very cooperatively and positively together, because, let me be clear, what is happening in Sydney just doesn't have implications for Sydney. What is happening in Sydney has very serious implications not only for the health of Sydney-siders, but also for the economy of Sydney, but also the economy of New South Wales and indeed the national economy. And that's why it's absolutely imperative that in this phase we're in now, the suppression phase, that we work together to ensure that we can suppress this latest outbreak as effectively as we possibly can. And we will work with the New South Wales government to give effect to that, both economically and from a health point of view.
How many more people do you expect to be
Sorry?
benefit from what you've announced today? And how much is that going to cost the federal budget? And $500 in Sydney doesn't go very far.
Well, first of all, the payments are set, particularly the $500, is exactly where JobKeeper was when JobKeeper was withdrawn at the end of March. So we're going back to JobKeeper level payments, same payments that we're helping people through JobKeeper in that final phase are the same payments that are being made available to people. I think the last data I saw was some 67,000 Sydney-siders had already accessed the payments here that are affected by the lockdown to date. I expect that number to increase. It's a disaster payment, so it's demand driven. We'll pay